Does anybody else here like really big words? I love them. Okay, so I'm going to throw out some big words, and let's just, if you don't mind, play along and see if we know what they mean. Mellifluous. Sweetly flowing like honey. So sometimes a person's name is just mellifluous, the way it sounds. Lugubrious. Very sad. I heard it once said, although I can't find it in the dictionary, that there's a word called brabdignagian, which apparently just means big. Quixotic. Quixotic. Unrealistically idealistic. It comes from Don Quixote. We're also supposed to eschew obfuscation, which means make things clearer. Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. What does it mean? Did anybody look it up when you sang Mary Poppins songs? Extraordinarily good or wonderful. Do you have a really favorite big word? That one that you just tuck away for times that you want to sound really smart? Well, I have got a big word for you today. Transfiguration. What does transfiguration actually mean? Well, here's a quote from a dictionary. Transfiguration means a complete change of form or appearance into a more beautiful or spiritual state. Well, that clarified it, right? Of course not. Because today, Transfiguration Sunday isn't an easy Sunday to figure out. Now, it implies that something has changed, that the figure of a person looks different. But what does it really mean? Mark Twain once recommended using big words when you really don't understand what's going on because it'll sound like you actually do. Well, to be blunt, this is a story that is one of the most difficult ones to understand in the Gospels. Now, we can understand it to a degree, but the very nature of what's going on in the story is that confusion is inherent in the events. We see the confusion cloud the minds of the three people with whom Jesus are in the story, Peter, James, and John. They get a glimpse of Jesus' divine glory. His clothes are dazzling white. They saw that glory was in him and that he had it. They saw Moses and Elijah speaking with him. But there's only confusion as this is going on. It didn't make sense to them. And after witnessing the events, they really had no idea what to do. So Peter even wanted to just build 3 shelters, tents, dwelling places, tabernacles, whatever phrase we use. He was afraid and confused. You know, I once heard about a head of nursing she was startled because she saw a patient fleeing down the hall out of an operating room, the loose gown just flapping in the background as he was running down. And she stopped the patient and said, "What's going on? Do you mind telling me why you're running from the operating room?" And the patient looked at her with startled eyes and said, "It's because of what the nurse said." "Oh, what did the nurse say?" The nurse said, "Be brave. An appendectomy, having your appendix removed, is quite simple." And she said, "Well, you know, I hate to say it, but it is quite simple. I would think that would have comforted you." "Are you kidding? The nurse was talking to the doctor, not me." You know, we might assume that the disciples who had been traveling with Jesus for some time might have had a better idea of what was really going on. But they were just as confused as that doctor trying to remove an appendix. We think we should get what's going on in the story, but of course, even we don't fully know. But clarity did eventually come when they all came down from the mountain, which is why then when we get to a later part in the story, it does begin to make sense. Because you see, after this mountaintop experience, Jesus began his journey to Jerusalem, his journey to the cross. And what happened there? His disciples, his friends, abandoned him. Even after hearing that voice from heaven that is pretty clear, "This is my son, listen to him." But they didn't listen. Jesus died a painful, miserable, and weak death at the hand of his enemies, abandoned by his friends, forsaken by God, utterly alone. But it's, of course, through the cross that all of this does begin to make sense. It's through the cross that even a confusing story like the one we hear today about the Transfiguration begins to be clearer. Because it was while Jesus was dying, nailed to a cross, that the criminal next to him believed in him. It was after his death on the cross that the centurion standing there believed that he was the Son of God. It was at the cross that all creation shook, that there was a terrible earthquake and the sun went black, that all creation cried out for what had just happened. It was when Jesus died that it began to make sense. It was after the cross that his disciples slowly began to fearlessly follow him. You know, this is something of what Martin Luther gets at when he talks about theology of the cross instead of a theology of glory. It's in seeing God's love through Jesus' vulnerable death, not his glorious transfiguration, that we understand God's love. God is glorious, but it's through God choosing to be vulnerable that we truly understand the love that God has for us. It's the cross that breaks our hearts. It's seeing God's love on the cross that leads us to know and believe, and ironically, it's through God's vulnerability that we understand God's power and glory. It works the same way when we sacrificially love one another, when we give of ourselves for our neighbors. It's not in a demonstration of greatness that we show God's love for each other. It's in our sacrificial acts. It's when we give up time like right now just to be here, to be in worship, to worship God despite the struggles and the craziness of the busyness of this world that tells us there's so many other things we need to be doing. It's by sacrificing even that hour. It's by sharing of our gifts. Beautiful musical gift. Thank you earlier for that solo. It's through sharing. It's when we're willing to risk. It's when we're willing not only to accept, but to boldly declare that all of this isn't just about me, or even just isn't about us. You know, this is one of the reasons I feel so honored to be called to Samaritas, to be serving in this call. Because I get to see 1,900 employees, that's how big we are now, 1,900 employees sacrificially help people through some of the hardest parts of their lives. And by walking with them, by going down from the mountain and walking with them through that dark valley of the shadow of death, seeing the true glory of God at work. I think of one young woman, I'm changing her name because she's a client and she's under 18 and everything, but we're going to call her Rebecca. Rebecca is one of the up to 60 youth that we send, foster kids, that we send to Stony Lake Lutheran Camp every year. Maybe you've been to Stony Lake or you have friends or people here that have been out there. I grew up going there, love the place. We send up to 60 foster youth so they can have 1 week where they can just be kids again. Sometimes these kids are separated from siblings because there's large numbers of kids and just one foster home can't hold them all. 1 week where they can play soccer and throw a frisbee and sail and just be brothers and sisters again. Well, this one girl that one congregation was generous enough to send, she gets there and she had trouble falling asleep the first night. And the reason Rebecca had trouble falling asleep is because she didn't have her comfort noise when she was going to bed. Do you know what I mean by a comfort noise? Do you have a comfort noise, something that helps you kind of know it's time to go to bed? Maybe a fan going? If you're like me, you've developed the bad habit of listening to a television set to fall asleep, which means I say that my wife developed that bad habit of marrying somebody who needs a TV to fall asleep. What was Rebecca's comfort noise? It was the sound of violence. That's what she heard going to bed every night. What does it do for a child's psyche if the sound of people fighting and arguing and violence is what helps you calm down to go to bed? So here's Rebecca in a cabin at Stony Lake, listening to the crickets, hearing the leaves on the trees rustle up above from the breeze that's blowing in from Lake Michigan less than a mile away. The kind of thing that many of us would spend a fortune and plan a year just to get, right, for a few days. It was hard on her that first night. By the way, she was also in a cabin without locks, and she grew up in a place that had locks not just to protect you against people outside, but people inside your home. So it wasn't an easy first night, but the second night was better. And by the end of the week, she knew that there's so much better that we can have in life. She was able to go through her vulnerability and deal with the darkness of what she had experienced and really begin to experience that glory of God. So here she was by the end of the week, experiencing a great week because people like us, some people who are members of this congregation, sent her to a camp, no strings attached, because we have a God who loves us, no strings attached. And now she knows that we have a God who loves us, no strings attached. See, the meaning of life isn't to look out for ourselves. It's to look out for our neighbors, to love God. And it's in doing this that God's love is better known. The cross doesn't make sense through the miracle of the mountain. The miracle of the mountain makes sense through the cross. Now, I do have to say, as I say that, I got to be honest with myself, I kind of like the flashy light show every once in a while. I probably would have been one of those people saying, okay, Jesus, another miracle? Come on, this is pretty cool. We all still want the power and the glory. We want the visions and the miracles, but we won't understand God's love or God's glory with those alone. We know the power and the glory through the greatest miracle, that God is vulnerable, that God is powerful, that God's real power and glory comes through the vulnerability. And again, this is something we see each and every day through the people of Samaritas. And when I say we, by the way, I'm not just talking about me. I'm not just talking about the employees, the people that work on our teams. I'm talking about you. I'm talking about the other 230 ELCA congregations in the Lower Peninsula, now a growing number of Presbyterian and Methodist and Episcopalian and United Church of Christ, and so many others who were getting on board with our mission of serving people as an expression of the love of Christ. That's the mission. Serve people as an expression of the love of Christ. And that means dive into the vulnerability and be there with people and walk alongside them. It means that when we have our 12.5 homes for people with disabilities across the state, we walk with people through those struggles. It means that for not just kids like Rebecca, but the other foster kids that we work with as well. Here's a few things about what we are doing as we walk with people through that valley. We are the largest private and adoption agency in the entire state of Michigan. That's us. Our churches gave birth to that. We're one of the largest faith-based nonprofits in the state of Michigan. We've done that. We have 5 senior living communities across the state. And because we know that not everybody can afford to live in a senior living community, we have 15 affordable living communities that we've worked with. So what we've done is we work through HUD housing, but as a nonprofit, we roll so much back into what we're doing because we want to be there for people and give them honor and love and dignity, just as Christ calls us to do. It's serving people as an expression of the love of Christ. And now we've begun to move into home health care, which has just come up to this area, because we know that not everybody is going to be able to stay in a senior living community. We know that not everybody wants to, or that they can afford to. We know that people heal better in their homes, so we want to be there with them and walk alongside them. This is the work that we are all doing together. You know, one of the things that's come up very recently, of course, we hear it in the news, is our refugee resettlement work. This is what that's meant for us. It meant that in the 90s and 2000, we